Alternative Dig Talk. Real issues, real talk.
Fellow citizens, following the sequence of events, Uganda seems to be at political crossroads.
I'm not a servant of anybody.
Madam, I know the law.
As such, Alternative Digital brings you the Interface Show with retired Colonel Dr. Kiza Besuje.
Let's keep on the same page on Alternative Digital,
As he gives you the alternatives on the transition question, rule of law, human rights and freedom, youth inclusion in governance, economic stagnation, as he confirms.
I'll be always here Saturday from 10 a.m. in the morning. Be there.
Don't miss the live discussion on the Alternative Uganda, Digital TV Facebook pages, and the Alternative Uganda YouTube channel.
The Alternative Dig Talk. Real issues, real talk.
And in Uganda it is 7 p.m. and our guest today, Mr. Hinds, who is stationed in Arizona, it's 9 a.m. In our show today, being a Wednesday, we have Caribbean link as always every Wednesday, and to be specific, we shall be tackling lots of issues, especially in regards to racial discrimination in Guyana, but also generally in Caribbean countries, and even, the whole world. I am Norman Tumuhimbise. We are streaming live on our Facebook pages. That's the Alternative Uganda, and also Digital TV. And herein we are in our studios based in Uganda, Kampala as a city, with my co-host, who should introduce himself, and then we shall definitely jump into getting to Dr. Hinds. May you say hello to our viewers.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, depending on where you're watching us from. I think some places it would actually be good afternoon. So wherever you are, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. You're welcome to today's edition of the Caribbean Link. My name is Roger Studiawe, and today it is a privilege to be here with the professor, Dr. Hinds, as we are going to be talking about a number of issues. I am also very particularly happy because he's a Marxist, and I have a particular interest in those issues. So I hope to learn a lot from him today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rogers. Doctor, may you please say hello to our viewers?
Hello, good morning, good evening to your viewers in Africa, on the continent. Good afternoon to those of you where it's afternoon. And I know in the Caribbean it's about midday, just past midday. And where I am, it's morning. So greetings to all of your listeners and viewers. And I'm happy to be here with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I think precisely to our viewers who may not have, had an opportunity to know who Dr. Hinds is, may you please precisely tell us who exactly Mr. Hinds is in either the political point of view, your professional point of view. So who is Dr. Hinds to our viewers, especially those in Africa?
Oh, well, I'm a public scholar, if that's an apt description, meaning that I'm an academic. I teach at a university in the United States of America, and that's what I've done for most of the last 3 decades or so. But I'm also a political activist. I was a political activist long before I got into the academy. And I am a member of the Working People's Alliance, which is the Dr. Walter Rodney, who I'm sure is well known in Africa, belong to. And so I am an executive member of that party, along with, like I said, being an academic. Well, you know, basically that's the that's who I am.
Thank you, Prof. In particular, we are aware that most of your expertise and rather experience is onto African studies, and in particular, we want to perhaps also get your wisdom in regards to racial discrimination generally, but also where it is so bitter, like in Guyana and in Caribbean, but also even in states where you are. You find there are lots of racial discriminations, conflicts, blacks. In fact, for some reason, you find even blacks against blacks. If it's a black in America, will be against a black of maybe African descent. What really causes such racial discriminations?
Well, the roots of racial discrimination in the diaspora, the African diaspora, lie in the enslavement project that race as a social and political and economic phenomenon arose out of plantation slavery in and around the mid-1700s. And what the invention of race did was that it set in place social relations, particular social relations that were premised on inequality of human beings. And so therefore, what the notion of race did was to give meaning to skin color. And so this skin color, for example, even the meaning of inferiority, inferior human being, non-human being. And of course, white was superior human beings. And so that paradigm became embedded in the institutions of the slave societies. And so even when slavery came to an end, the institutions survived slavery. And so we have institutions to this day that are premised and that function based on the notion of racial discrimination, or what we loosely call racism. And so when one looks at the United States and one looks at the Caribbean and wherever Latin America, and against African people of African descendants, then we have to trace that discrimination back to slavery. But more than that, we have to understand that discrimination within the context of the institutions that were created during slavery and survived slavery. You may ask, well, why those institutions, long after slavery, continue to function the way? Well, there are privileges that are accrued to those to the white descendants. And so therefore, if human beings are getting privileges, benefits from a system, from an institution, then they are less likely to want to change that institution. And so we have a notion of racism based on racial inequality continuing because it accrues benefits to sections of the population. And you have anti-racism, anti-racist movements because the system of racism does not accrue benefits to Black people, to people of African descent. And so they're the ones who are constantly trying to change the system.
Thank you. I don't know whether you have something teaching that you would want to ask you before you also...
I'm listening attentively because his definition is literally for a person who is deeply Marxist. Now, I wanted to... Now, he has given us a sort of a background for today's discussion. But I wanted to take you a little back, Professor, to the background of the Working People's Alliance and how that is, what was the foundation upon which it was formed? Where is it right now? Because it seemed to have, It was so vibrant during the times of the Walter Rodneys and the likes, but it has since lost spotlight. We no longer hear so much about it. How is it right now?
Well, let me take you back to the beginning. The Working People's Alliance arose as part of a global phenomenon at the turn of the 1970s and early 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, as more and more of our countries in Africa and the Caribbean are becoming independent. The question arose as to what kind of independence. Would independence be just a reform of the colonial system, or would independence mean a fundamental transformation of the society away from colonialism? The generation of leaders that took power in Africa and the Caribbean, most of them opted for a number of reasons, subjective and objective, for a mere reform of the system. The generation that grew up with independence, that is the generation that grew up in the 1950s, came of age in the 1960s, challenged that notion of independence. That generation felt that independence should mean a fundamental transformation of the society, nothing less. And so, therefore, there was a wave of thought that arose, philosophical notions of independence. And Africa, for example, Uganda, at the university there, the university in Dar es Salaam, those universities, the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean, and many of the historically Black universities in the United States, they became part of this movement for transformation of the society. And so what we had was a fusion of activist academics and workers coming together and arguing for a different kind of independence. And so the Working People's Alliance arose out of that. It arose out of four organizations. An organization called Ratoon that was based at the University of Guyana, an organization called the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, that was a Pan-Africanist / Black Power organization. And then there was an Indian organization, the Indian People's Revolutionary Associates, and there was a group called the Working People's Vanguard Party. It left shortly after. But those were the organizations that came together to form the Working People's Alliance. And the orientation was a kind of most of the activists were Marxists in orientation. The WPA described itself as independent Marxists because it wanted to make a distinction between the Europeanized Marxism and the Marxism that took into consideration the social, economic, and political conditions of the place. So, as with activists in Africa and the Caribbean and in the United States and other parts of the diaspora, there was the attempt to grapple with the old question of race and class. How do you use Marxism as a form of mobilization within the context of racial division? Because you in Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania would know that because you do have East Indians from India, Asians in your society. And so when we talk about race in Guyana, we are talking about race within an ethnic context, as you would understand in Uganda and other parts of East Africa. And so we are grappling with this question of ethno-racial composition of the society and the Marxist form of mobilization that speaks to class. And so the Working People's Alliance arose within that context. Now, the government in Guyana, like most governments in the immediate post-independence era, opted for a mixture of progressive policies, but authoritarian governance. You know, whether we go back to, Ghana or Guinea or Tanzania or Uganda, we are seeing these leaders in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica. We are seeing leaders who are advancing progressive policies that are aimed at lifting the poor out of the condition they're in. They're aimed at turning slave plantations into nations. They're aimed at turning colonies into nations. And so, on the one hand, there is progressive policies as far as social development is concerned. But on the other hand, there is this authoritarian mode of governance that did not deal well with those who disagreed. They did not deal well with dissent. And so we had this complex, this contradiction. And the WPA was born into that kind of situation, and therefore became a challenge to the government of the day from the left, but a radical left that says, yes, we agree with progressive domestic policy, progressive foreign policy, but we feel that at the end of the day, that those policies will not yield the type of results that they should if they are not grounded in the notion of revolutionary democracy. And so for us, democracy was more than just elections. It was more than just going to the poll every 5 years, but it was about an economic democracy that speaks to social equality. It was about an ethnic democracy that speaks to racial equality. And more than that, it must be a democracy that gives the ordinary people, wherever they are, whether in their communities or their workplaces, a say in what is going on in the society. So it was a radical alternative that the WPA represented.
I'll follow up on that one. You seem to have made a good alliance during those days with the PPP when you were opposing the Barnum administration back in the 1980s and 79s. But as we see right now, of course, as you said, the Marxism and all that is to make sure that people are all equal. Would you say that those values still stand right now? Do you think Guyana as it stands represents the principles and notions of the Marxism as you were representing the WPA back in the day?
Well, times have changed. Times have changed. I mean, WPA came into being in 1974. We are now into 2023, almost 50 years later. And the world has changed. And as the world has changed, I think as political activists, we have to adjust to a changed world. One must be ideological, but one must not be a prison of ideology. One must be able to use ideology to guide what one is, and one should not be slavishly led by ideology. And so therefore, in this era of neoliberalism, in an era where in Guyana, the Communist Party has now become a mixture of neoliberalism and ethnic domination. It means that the Marxist alternative has to now adjust to meet this new dispensation. You know, it was Engels who I think said the only thing that we are certain about is change. You know, the only thing we are certain, and change occurs. And so, therefore, as we confront this new dispensation of ethnic domination within the context of a neoliberal economic strategy, then a political party and Marxists must adjust to this new situation. The question is there social injustice as there was 50 years ago? Yes, there is social injustice. Is there racial injustice today? Yes, even more than it was in 50 years ago. And so how does the Marxists come to grips with this new dispensation where the emphasis should be? Should the emphasis be on class when the state, the government is waging war on one ethnic group? And so there is an ethnic confrontation. Does the Marxists stand up and talk about class dispensation and class struggle within the context of where there is a clear indication on the part of the government that it is mobilizing based on ethnicity? It is dividing the resources of the country, which have become much more than they were 50 years ago because of oil. It is dividing those resources unequally. It is using the state to wage war on one ethnic group. How does a Marxist respond to that situation? Do we use the same rhetoric of class struggle in the same way as we did 50 years before? Or do we seek to deal with the question of ethnicity and race upfront, always keeping our mind on the ultimate objective, which is to democratize the society along the lines of class?
I would definitely want to, chip into your discussion, in particular with the specific examples. We are trying to drink from the well of wisdom, especially in regards to some of the political ideologies and where you subscribe to Marxism theories. I want to ask a straight question. Why are Marxists considered radical? Because even how if you look at the Malcolm X, you look at the Fidel Castro, rather, you look at the Che Guevara, there is that bit of radicalism in you, okay, in quotes. Like, people consider you being radical, and as such, that's why, for example, there was some bit of conflict between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Like, these two activists couldn't connect. Why are people considering you as radicals?
Well, radical comes from the word radicalism, and radicalism talks about going to the roots. Amil Cabral talked about going to the source. And you see, if you are radical, you are saying, what is the root of this problem? And how are you going to solve this problem? Are you going to solve this problem by just trimming off some leaves at the top? Or are you going to go to the very root of the problem and try to uproot that root and transform the society in a way that it leaves behind the toxic system that you are trying to get rid of? And so in that sense, we are called radicals, because we attempt to get to the root of the society. No, they are Marxists, and they were Marxists who are not radical Marxists. They are Marxists who are orthodox Marxists. Are ripe for the revolution and all that kind of stuff and so on. Now, if you are a Marxist from Africa, a post-colonial society, or the Caribbean, a post-colonial society, you don't have time to wait until the time is right for the revolution. You have to make the revolution here and now, because you've got to uproot 400 years of enslavement. You don't have time to work out your political system. First, chop off some king heads, and as they did in England and so forth. You don't have time to wait until you settle your political system, and then you go to settling what kind of economic system you want, etc. You've got to do all of that simultaneously. And so, therefore, the nature of the society itself, as a post-plantation society, demands a different kind of Marxist approach. It demands a radical Marxist approach because the system of enslavement and colonialism radically changed Africa, radically changed Caribbean. And if we are to find our place in a world that was not made for us, because remember, Ghana is becoming independence in 1957, setting in stage independence for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. But the winners of the war, the Second World War, had already met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and came up with a new world order that did not include sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean, because we were not countries, we were colonies. So we are becoming independent, starting with Ghana in 1957 there in Africa, and Trinidad and Jamaica 1962 in the Caribbean. We are entering a world that was not made for us. And so therefore, we have to navigate our independence within the context of all of these concentric circles. You have the Cold War going on at the time we are becoming independent. And so therefore we have got to navigate all these roadblocks along the way. And we can't do it by being, as the independence leaders thought that the way to do it, they had to be practical. But what radicals are saying is that pragmatism moved from being a tactic to being an end in itself. That is what happened in a lot of the African countries and the Caribbean countries. This pragmatic approach, which started out as tactic, became now strategy and ended itself. And the radicals are saying, oh, no, you have to distinguish between tactic and strategy. And so therefore, you are constantly looking to see how you can transform the society to meet the challenges, these challenges that are external and internal. The external challenges of the Cold War, the external challenge of imperialism, and the internal challenge of how to manage power. How to manage power. I think our post-colonial leaders, or immediate post-colonial leaders, did a terrible job at managing power. Now, some of them did fairly okay in terms of social policies. Tanzania with Ujamaa, for example, Michael Manley with democratic socialism, Forbes Burnham with cooperative socialism, Dr. Nkrumah with his Pan-African Marxist kind of orientation. They did okay in terms of understanding social policies for lifting the poor, but they did terrible the management of power. And so therefore we come out of the early decades of independence without seeing kind of socio-economic transformation that they wanted. We couldn't see it because the price that we had to pay for those social policies in terms of governance was too high. And so we didn't see, in fact, as I would say, the progressive policies could not be sustained because they were being done within the context of authoritarianism.
First, to my co-host, I want to ask you a polite question on whether you would be kind enough to accept that Marxism is literally not understood by people who belong to our generation. Because literally, if you look at the behavioral characters of, let's say, capitalists, it's slightly easy for someone to say, okay, I associate with capitalists. But would you accept that Marxism is understood by people of your generation, and perhaps very, very few, by the way, if they do exist, like you and a few others, that people haven't understood the theory, that ideology of Marxism? Because amongst young people, remember, in line with your profession, you have interacted with many and taught many. Do you find young people understanding the Marxism ideology in your view?
No. And you're quite right. You're quite right. The younger generations do hear the word, and it means little or nothing to them. And that is quite understandable, because what has happened in places like Africa and the Caribbean, Latin America, as we move out of the 1980s and we move into the era of structural adjustment and what we now call neoliberalism, there was the narrative that look, socialism failed. Socialism failed in Africa. It failed in the Caribbean. It failed in Latin America and parts of Asia. And so therefore, that narrative of failure became part of the understanding or lack of understanding of what Marxism is. So in a sense, Marxism became the victim of what the West call the failure of socialism. Now, Walter Rodney was quite insightful. He saw development in Africa and by extension the Caribbean and Latin America and Asia, that the underdevelopment of these societies were to the imperialist extraction of our resources, hence their own development. So they're saying to us, your underdevelopment was because you experimented with Marxism. And we are saying to them, but in order to counter the underdevelopment that was caused by your imperialistic action, we were forced to look for alternative means of development, hence our embrace of aspects of Marxism. And so therefore, the failure that you are talking about here, the failure to develop these societies, lie not in the Marxist or socialist experiment. It lies in the long centuries of extraction of our resources, the long centuries of underdevelopment of our societies. And so therefore, it's not Marxism. But that conversation, we did not have the chance to have that conversation at the mass level, because now the IMF and the World Bank came in, and we had to turn our sights to fighting against structural adjustment and neoliberalism. We had changes in the politics. The PPP in Guyana has come to power. It stopped being Marxist. It accepts structural adjustment, and it became an ethnocracy. Ethnic domination become part of its ideology. And so we had to pivot very quickly and to begin to fight the new struggle. So we never had a chance to have that conversation with the masses about socialism and Marxism. And so an entire generation or two have grown up either not knowing about Marxism, or when they confront it, they push it aside as something that is alien to them, and that is an abject failure.
Please, so in that regard, in the event that we all accept that our generation does not understand what Marxism really has for them, what is that is close as an alternative to Marxism? Is there some bit of hybrid, for lack of another word? Should we say there is some bit of hybrid of an ideology that perhaps brings about the ideas of Marxism and maybe socialism and perhaps capitalism? Is there any an alternative as a professor in that field?
I'm very glad for that question, because hybrid, even when we were Marxists, and we in the Caribbean never accepted a Marxist with a one-party state. We were very clear. In the WPA, we once said that we did not believe in the dictatorship of any social group. The Marxists talk about dictatorship of the proletariat, and we said we did not believe in the dictatorship of any group. We did not believe in the one-party system. We believe in a multi-party system. And so our Marxism in the Caribbean was always a Marxism that was a kind of hybrid, a Marxism that was grounded in an indigenous notion of democracy, a Marxism that was grounded in the notion of multi-racialism or non-racialism, a Marxism that was grounded in the notion that Marxists alone could not bring about change in society, and so that we had and we have to engage in alliances with those who are patriotic but are not necessarily Marxists. And so therefore, our Marxism in terms of our praxis was always one of hybridity, was always one that takes into consideration the conditions that we had to deal with. Our Marxism was always a Marxism that took into consideration the very nature of the society as post-plantation society that sets it apart from European societies. And so therefore, today, we still have that kind of hybridity. The question for Marxists is, for me, and for us in the Working People's Alliance, is not so much about whether you call yourself a Marxist. It is whether you are in fact engaged in the work of Marxism. And that is if you understand Marxism to be a critique of capitalism first and foremost. And then a praxis talks about lifting those at the bottom, to lifting them to a position of equality. Then you are always doing that kind of work. And you cannot always do that work guided by the iron tenets, excuse me, the iron tenets of Marxism. You have to do that work by constantly adjusting. You see, you don't start with Marxism. You start with the nature of the society. And in a slave society and a colonial society, you're constantly adjusting. You're constantly trying to free yourself, but you're constantly trying to survive. That's our dialectic. Our dialectic is how to survive while you are trying to change. And so our understanding of dialectics is not necessarily the traditional Marxist understanding of dialectics. We are constantly trying to survive. That's our dialectics. And so for us, we start with the society and then allow the Marxism to adjust to that society rather than starting with the ideology and then you end up imposing the idea on the society, you know? So we are still doing Marxist work, the old work of equality, the struggle for equality, the struggle against foreign capital, the struggle with ethnic society for ethnic equality, and most of all, the struggle for a national government. Because one of the things that we have learned after 60 years of independence is that we are not going to move these former colonial outposts to become viable societies, viable economies, viable polities in the world if we don't bring together all of the forces. Now, the mistake that Nkrumah and Nyerere and others made is that they wanted to bring all the forces on one party. I think today we have learned that that's a failed strategy. We have to bring the forces together in an alliance rather than within the umbrella of one party. So in a sense, we are trying today to correct the mistakes of the Nkrumahs and Nyereres and others, and trying to say it is not about the party. It is about the society as a whole. And so you bring together all of the forces in the society, not under the umbrella of the party, but they bring them together under the umbrella of a national consensus.
Professor.
Let's cross to my co-host.
Yes. Thank you so much for those insights. You see, when you talk about Marxism as it is, even the proponents, those of the Soviets and the Chinese who fought the successful socialist revolutions back in the days, seem to have also embraced the hybrid of a bit of capitalism and socialism to sort of, accommodate the current age. But away from that, I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to put specific case study to Guyana as one, with the current ethnopolitics. And obviously the fractured democracy that has happened because of those ethnic politics and all that kind of stuff. Do you think, because you said Marxism is one that diagnoses the problem of the society and tries to find a solution, do you think there is a way Marxism and that radical Marxism can sort the problem of ethnopolitics and fractured democracy in Guyana?
I think it can contribute to, but I don't think it has the full answer. And Marxism, like all ideologies, have their limitations. And Karl Marx did not spend enough time studying ethnic societies. He studied European societies, you know, and European societies were, for the most part, homogeneous ethnic societies. And so, therefore, he could not have understood a place like Uganda, or a place like Tanzania or Kenya or Guyana or Trinidad and Tobago, Fiji, because these places had this whole issue of ethnicity. And so, therefore, Marxism does, at the level of equality, social equality, offers some tools to deal with the ethnic societies. But one has to draw on other thought processes in order to try to bring about some kind of understanding in those ethnic societies. So in addition to Marxism, one has to draw, for example, on some of the nationalist ideology, the black nationalist ideology, the Indian nationalist ideology. I don't know much about the latter, but the former. One has to draw on the thoughts of W.B. Du Bois. One has to draw on the thoughts of Malcolm X. One definitely must draw on the thoughts of Walter Rodney, who are always trying to find a synthesis between class. And so, therefore, you have to draw on the praxis that explains race and ethnicity, and on the praxis that explains class. Hence, the black Marxists as distinct from other Marxists. And so, I think the question in a place like Guyana now is a national question. It's the national question, and that is how, in the age of plenty now in Guyana has oil and gas, wealth, and the traditional economists have always told us that once the pie is enlarged, then the ethnic boundaries will disappear. Well, what we have seen in Guyana is the total opposite. As the pie has enlarged, the ethnic boundaries have become more rigid. And so that old economic thesis that you enlarge the pie and magic happens is thrown out the window. We now have to draw on the analysis of our past scholars, but we have to create our own analysis. Walter Rodney did not analyze a Guyana that had oil wealth and look at ethnicity within the context of growing wealth. He did not. And so we use Rodney, but we also have to come up with our own diagnosis of the problem. And so our generation of scholars and activists are called upon to do extra work. And so that is the challenge we face in Guyana. How do we bring about ethnic solidarity? How do we get the Indian working class and the African working class to understand their common destiny within a context of the enlarged pie? And that pie is being distributed by a political party that has dumped Marxism and that has embraced the notion of ethnic domination. So that the Indian working class in Guyana no longer sees its destiny tied up with the African working class, and vice versa. And that if you were to go and tell them that, it will sound like theory, because their actual experience tells them differently. How do you, as a Marxist, as a progressive, engage that situation? And that is what we are trying to work out in Guyana. We don't know that we are correct. We in the Working People's Alliance, we have said, as far as we are concerned, there is social injustice, but there is racial oppression. And that the racial oppression is felt by the African community. So the African community faces social injustice and racial oppression. The Indian community faces social injustice, but not racial oppression. And so we therefore say that our objective now has to be the erasure. It has to be the overthrow of ethnic dominance. Because ethnic dominance stands in the way of social justice and social cohesion. And so therefore, we are now zero in on ethnic dominance and fighting ethnic dominance because we feel that that ethnic dominance stands in the way of social cohesion and social justice.
Prof, thank you for the insight. While you were deliberating on the very topical discussion, I was trying to think through about the successful Marxists. Save for, of course, Cuba hasn't done so bad, but you will definitely have a few examples of those successful Marxists. Are there specifics in as far as those some developed countries that you think in this country they were led by this Marxist and this ideology indeed worked? Because to be honest with you, you'll hear of capitalists and as considered to be developed, but Marxism, I think it hasn't sunk into so many. Are there those live examples that you could perhaps point on to?
Well, depend on what you mean by success. If you mean by success in terms of the first years of independence, bringing about some kind of social mobility for those at the bottom of the social ladder, one can point to a number of African countries. One can point to some Caribbean and Latin American countries that were relatively successful in doing that. But like we said, what was the price that we had to pay for those kinds of progressive? Now we have in our hemisphere the Cuban Revolution, which is the mother of all how to survive as a Marxist revolutionary state. I mean, they can write the book for the rest of humanity because they've survived. I would think Cuba is a success as far as social and economic democracy is concerned. And those who are anti-Marxist will say that they have been a failure in terms of political democracy. I want to be a little bit more nuanced and to say that the kind of success that we've seen in Cuba, and I've been to Cuba, and I've seen the success in terms of social democracy and economic democracy. And one asks the question, one must ask the question, if Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of the greatest and most powerful militarily capitalist state, could have the kind of social and economic democracy without some form of authoritarian grip on the society? Is it possible? And I would think that Cuba would not have been able to protect what its social and economic gains if it had not closed the society somewhat. And I'm not justifying authoritarianism here. I'm merely making an observation that has to do with the particularity of Cuba, and that Cuba has survived as a Marxist state precisely because it adopted the praxis of the social and economic democracy and some form of commandism in the society in order to keep the vultures away from the gate. And so I think when one talks about a Cuba, the success of a Cuba, one has to talk about it within the context of Cuba geopolitically, because I think geopolitics is what informed what happens in Cuba in terms of the management of political power. And so I would see Cuba as a success story. Now, we in the Caribbean had the Grenadian Revolution, which lasted for 4 years. And it's amazing what they were able to do in Grenada in 4 years at the level of social and economic democracy, and also at broadening political democracy to the grassroots. Tremendous work in 4 years. On Monday last was 4 years since, 44 years since the Grenadian Revolution of 79, March 13th. And so the Grenadian Revolution in 4 years showed what could be done with literacy, for example, what could be done with accruing wealth from a very narrow political basis, an island, 60 or 70,000 people, small population, no economies of scale to talk about, no set of natural resources, but they were able to make economic strides that far outstrip their Caribbean neighbors in 4 years. So, one can talk about a success story there. The question for the Grenadians, as the question for all Marxist revolutions, was how do you sustain that within the context of the hostility of the Cold War and within the context of an indigenous political culture that is authoritarian. You don't be on that plantation for 400 years, an authoritarian space, and you don't inculcate some of the authoritarianism. And so I'm saying the kind of authoritarianism that we saw from our African leaders and our Caribbean leaders and so on, in part it came from that experience of domination on the slave plantation and the institutions that were given to them at the time of independence. The Westminster institution, the Westminster form of winner-take-all government makes dictators out of people. Because you realize if you get 51% of the power, you get 100% of the power, 51% of the votes. You get 100% of the power. And so this competition for ultimate power, I think, was part and continues to be part of the reason for the authoritarian trajectory we see in post-plantation societies. And so therefore, even as Nkrumah, I think, was successful in the few years in trying to bring about some kind of social development, in trying to bring about some kind of Pan-African consciousness among his people. I think the Ujamaa experiment in Tanzania by Nyerere had some successes, even in your own country. I think why Milton Obote would not have called himself a Marxist, in terms of social development in the early years of independence, one could say that he made some strides, but all of them succumbed to the pressure of imperialism and this propensity to reach for authoritarianism.
Fred, we are out of time. For lack of another word, we have strictly around 6 or so minutes. I would ask my co-host to go through the comments precisely, so that if there is any specific response to any of the comments, we shall perhaps call it a day thereafter. Rogers, if there are some comments or questions, and with Prof, I will ask you that you precisely, answer them straight away, and then we shall remember our show is meant to close at 8 p.m. East African time, and that is, I think, 10 a.m. Arizona time. So kindly, Rogers, you could perhaps throw in the comments or questions.
Yes, there are some comments that are only sharing. Some of them that are just thanking people, but I'm going to ask those that need answers, because in the interest of time. There's Nache Unirita says, how has Marxist ideology shaped and guided Guyanese politics and the Caribbean at large?
Tremendously so. It was one of the major currents. There have been 2 currents that have guided Caribbean politics, and that is the current of pragmatism, not right-wing. The right wing has never taken root. It's a kind of centrist pragmatism that has guided. And the other force in the society is Marxist, radical Marxism, revolutionary Marxism. And I think even today, even to a person who may not be conscious of Marxism, if you look at some of the young politicians coming out of the region, they do reflect a synthesis, crude as it may be, but a kind of synthesis between that pragmatism of the independence leaders and the radical Marxist tradition.
And there's another, Ethan Mwine, says, Professor, you're saying that Marxism, in its original form, may not address the current political lacunas in certain societies. But even the few of you who know live in the diaspora far away from the ground realities that require implementation of your diagnosed problems. So how are you going to address that issue also?
Activism. I just got back from Guyana. I was on spring break and I went to Guyana. I was on the ground. We held 4 meetings and we have the country rocking and rolling because we spoke directly to our brothers and sisters in the armed forces who are predominantly African, and we asked them not to turn their guns on their brothers and sisters when they protest. And the government, which has politicized the armed forces, are up in arms against us because we have burst the bubble. So yes, we are on the ground. There is no substitute for activism. And that is why I refer to myself as an activist scholar, or a scholar activist. There is no substitute for being on the ground with the people. And as CLR James has always said, there is always something to be done.
Right. And John says that let the world know what's going on in Guyana. I think that is what he has. Another one says, good evening, watching from Ankara. I'm interested in the Caribbean politics, so I hope to learn from the professor. I think that one has gotten their message. Good evening, doctor, and the hosts. The others are only appreciating your time. Some of them, most of them are actually doing that. But I don't know if he has something to
No. I think precisely, okay, our technical team is already telling us that we are already out of time. But it's just, I don't know whether we could use it as a take-home, and perhaps that will guide us in our next episode in the event that we get your time. Because I was trying to think through my mind and realized that most of the Marxists have been assassinated. And if you may follow the sequence of events, you'll hear and understand that the Cuban former president, Castro, the attempts to assassinate him were more than 300 or so. You look at Patrice Lumumba in our neighborhood here, Congo, assassinated. I mean, you
America
look at
Cabral
very many, Che Guevara and so many. So I hope you are safe and they are not here to assassinate you because you are a Marxist. Your parting shots, and then we shall call it a day, sir.
Say it again for me. I didn't get the last question.
Yeah, your closing remarks.
No, my closing remarks. Well, Bob Marley asked, how long shall they kill our pride? We stand aside and look. Some say it's just a part of it. They got to fulfill this book. Won't you hear the song? Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Only you yourself can do it. The words of Marcus Messiah Garvey, put into song by Robert Nesta Manley. I think it aptly describes what you say. Listen, we are now in a global world, and I think that as we have been talking about Marxism, I think Pan-Africanism is an even more urgent call for us at this time. There was some Pan-Africanism in the early independence days. I grew up as a child where we celebrated Ghana Day every year. It was a big celebration, and they have revived it now in Guyana. They just celebrated it in early March, Ghana Day. There's a Ghana Day committee in Guyana. And so I want to make a plea for a return to the source, to quote Cabral again, a return to a kind of Pan-Africanist praxis. Because after all is said and done, after 60, 70 years of independence, we are back to where we began. We are not going to be able to advance our independence as individual nation states. Our independence, and we are still working on our independence project, all of us, can only be advanced by holding our hands across the waters and linking our hearts back to the source. And so Africa has a lot to offer the Caribbean. The Caribbean has a lot to Africa. And if together we can go back to where we were in the 1950s and the 1960s, I think we can play some role in advancing our own development. How does one use the oil wealth in Guyana to advance not only the Guyanese cause, but the larger Caribbean cause and the larger African diaspora cause? And that is why it's important for African Guyanese to be able to share in the wealth of Guyana. Because if we are able to share in that wealth of Guyana, we can share our portion of that wealth with our Caribbean and African brothers and sisters. So I think one of the objectives of Black radicals today is a renewal of the Pan-African praxis.
We don't have, I mean, we cannot add even a sentence, only to wish you a good day, because we understand in Arizona it's now, it's a morning.
Yes.
And also asking the people in Guyana to definitely hear your words and of course do what they ought to do. And in particular, Africa as a continent also, I mean, bring its contribution on board so that we do not lose the bondage. May God bless one and bless all of you. Till next week, Wednesday, same time from Uganda, East Africa.